How's it going, everyone? Quick video lecture here to discuss scientific literacy. And so in this course, not only will we become more accustomed to writing and communicating about science, we will become much better at reading and deciphering science in a range of formats. And that's primarily what this lecture is about. So today what I would like to walk you through are a few things. I want to talk to you first about something that tends to be a pretty nebulous subject to college students, especially earlier in their career, and that is the purpose and audience of academic or scientific journals. So I want to give you some insight into that, and that may give you some perspective into why those documents are written and how we should approach them. I also want to talk to you about the importance of being able to quickly read and understand the scientific literature. And so that really will dovetail nicely from our discussion about the purpose and the audience of that literature. Then I want to teach you maybe the most important thing of the semester, and that is a rhetorical or writing concept called MAPS. And that should really help you. It kind of works like a compass for writing, and it gets you pointed in the right direction. All of the writing assignments that we'll do this semester, the ones that are outlined on the syllabus. And then finally, we'll talk about definitions and their importance to scientific writing, and I will refresh your memory to something that you probably ran up against in your college composition class, which is the principle of writing as a process, not just a product. So that's really what our goals are for this video lecture. If you have any questions after you've watched the video, please feel free to email me those questions. So one of the things that you're going to be asked to do a lot in your later undergraduate and graduate career is to read scientific or academic journals. And you know, it probably wasn't until I was a junior as an undergrad that somebody really explained to me what these publications and documents were all about. So I'm hopefully doing you a little bit of favor and saving you a little bit of grief, but you've probably had some interaction with them. You've probably been asked to use peer-reviewed articles or sources for a research paper or research project. So you have some experience probably accessing and using these from the library databases, maybe from Google Scholar, and you probably have at least some sense of what they are. But I want to just lay a really important foundation as to what scientific journals are and what they are not. Typically, scientific journals are hyper-specific publications, and they can come out weekly, they can come out monthly, they can come out quarterly, they can come out annually. So they come out in a range of sort of periods, and they're mostly used to present new knowledge, knowledge that has been gained or developed by experts. And so really the purpose is to share that new knowledge. And the audience for these documents or these publications really are experts. So they are written for and by experts. And when I say experts, I mean typically people with PhDs, usually professors and researchers at universities who are studying these particular topics. And so what they're fundamentally meant to do is to create conversation between experts about a given topic. And when I say they're hyper-specific, I really mean that. There are academic journals that focus specifically on certain types of diseases. There are academic journals that focus on individual animals, like the example in the presentation here, Ursus, which focuses exclusively on the biology of bears. And so what you get are these experts in a particular area, maybe somebody who studies the upper gastrointestinal tract, writing to other experts who study the upper gastrointestinal tract. And so these tend to be very technical, very dense, and very hard to penetrate publications. Yeah, and that's because they are passing on such specific information. When it comes to academic journals, there's a pretty wide range in readership, prestige, and impact. So in terms of readership, while I would make the case that 99 times out of 100 an academic journal is hyper-specific and hyper-focused on a very specific research interest or area of knowledge, there are some that are a little bit more broad, like Nature or the journal Science, etc., which kind of cast a wider net. But for the most part, they're very specific. There are even, to give you a sense, in the humanities, there are academic journals that focus exclusively on individual writers. So you may have an academic journal that focuses on Mark Twain, and it's primarily written by and for people who spend their lives studying the literature of Mark Twain. So there's an expectation that when you pick one of these documents up, that you have a base level of knowledge about the topic, that this is not your first time reading about the upper gastrointestinal tract or Mark Twain, for example. Scientific journals come in a range of prestige, so some are very, very prominent and prestigious and exclusive and hard to publish your work in, and are held in extremely high regard with respect to their credibility and the authority of their information. And so that's something to keep in mind too, that not all academic journals are created equally. And they have a range of impact. So, and that's partly based on the two things that I previously mentioned, readership and prestige. Some journals just tend to produce more important information than others, and there are actually ways that we measure that, and they're called impact factors. We don't really need to get into that, but just know that there's a range of scientific journals out there. And so what this should do is give you some relief that when you read something in a scientific journal, you're really not the intended audience. But that doesn't mean that we can't get important information from these documents. And it doesn't mean that you shouldn't be reading them to get a better understanding of areas of interest for you. So I think that's important. The other thing that I want to point out is that scientific journals, like we talked about, are peer-reviewed, which means that, say I write an article about teaching writing at a community college and I submit it to a journal that is about teaching writing at a community college. Before that information gets published, it's going to be scrutinized and read by a fellow expert in teaching writing at a community college. And they're probably going to give me feedback and revision ideas and give me things to think about that I can incorporate in that. And then that's invariably going to make my work better. And that's sort of the way that information gets reviewed before it's published in these publications. And that's why it's sort of the gold standard of information in an academic setting, because it has been scrutinized and there is a pretty stringent editorial control over what gets published. So just keep that in mind. That's why we hold them in such high esteem, is because typically, not always, and we will talk this semester about cases where this has gone awry, but typically it's very credible and useful information. So when you're reading these academic journal articles or these scholarly or scientific journal articles, it's really easy to get bogged down because you are not a researcher. You do not have a PhD. You are not trained in these certain research methodologies and experiment designs and statistical principles. So sometimes it can be very difficult to wade through all of the data and information. And so what I would encourage you is to not get bogged down. And there are some ways to do that, and one of which is to kind of zoom out. And so typically when we talk about an academic journal article, we talk about the IMRAD structure, which means introduction, methods, results, analysis, discussion, and usually some type of conclusion, but that's not included in the beautiful little acronym. And so there are only certain parts of an academic journal article that are really relevant to us as non-PhD carrying people with interest in a particular topic. So, and these questions really get us thinking about what we should be looking for in each of those sections, this list here basically follows the IMRAD structure. So the first question is, what are these people trying to figure out? What is their question? What new knowledge are they trying to present? For instance, maybe they want to know the role of diet in mitigating symptoms of attention deficit hyperactive disorder, and so then they go out and they do a study. And along the way, they're probably going to tell you why this matters. And that's another question. Why do we need to know this? Well, maybe some people are not particularly responsive to prescription medication, or maybe it could be a more holistic way of treating a particular disorder. Typically, these two things are going to be introduced in, you guessed it, the introduction. And that's where they're going to lay out sort of the scope and the aims of their study, what they were trying to figure out, and why they were trying to figure it out. Then typically they're going to go through a methods section, and that's where they're going to say, here's how we figured it out. Okay, we did a double-blind experiment where one group got a placebo and the other group got the intervention, or we conducted a survey of people, or we held interviews or focus groups. And the methods section is where things in a scientific journal article can get really messy, because this is where things get really technical, because people tend to use very specific instruments very specific ways of conducting their studies, and sometimes that's above our pay grade, so to speak, and they're going to reference things that you and I may not know about, certain statistical tests that they run, or certain lab protocols that they used, and that's okay, but we should get some sense of how they tried to figure this larger question out. Were they conducting an experiment? Were they reading existing literature and doing statistical analysis on old findings? Were they administering a survey? Were they talking to people? What were they doing? Maybe it was a combination of those things, but you should be able to read an article and answer those three questions pretty quickly. What are they trying to figure out? Why does it matter? And how are they trying to figure it out? A sub-question to the how are they trying to figure it out is who or what did they study? So sometimes we have to have a sample population of people that we're going to study. Maybe they wanted to focus on 11 to 15-year-old males, for instance. Or maybe they wanted to focus on only people over the age of 65. But we should have some sense of who their sample population is. Maybe they tried to randomize the population and they tried to get equal representation. That's not often the case, but sometimes that is a goal of a study. But you should have some sense of who they were looking at or what they were looking at. And that's generally going to be found in the methods section. In the results section, that's where you're going to basically find out what they found out. Now again, the results section can be very, very technical. It can be based on statistical principles that, frankly, I don't understand. And so it's important to, again, look for the simpler language, the bottom line. And a lot of times you're going to find that in the conclusion and in the discussion section. Results, again, you may find sections that are dense with graphs and tables and charts of information talking about the standard deviation and n, little n, big N, p, t-value. And unless you have a background in statistics, none of that, it's possible that none of that will make sense. So it's important to take a look into the discussion and the conclusion section, because that's typically where they'll say something very simple like, we found that diets lower in sugar reduced some of the symptoms of ADHD, for instance. And it may be more nuanced than that. But generally, you will find a sentence or two that really lays out the bottom line of the study. When I say what does it mean, that's basically a question about what are the implications of this. Does this mean we immediately should start promoting new diets among this population? Should we immediately start prescribing this drug or using this intervention? And then the final question that you should ask are there any limitations to this new knowledge? So, and usually there are. Good scientific writers will be upfront about those limitations. Maybe they used a small sample size. Maybe they were only able to look at one population. Maybe there were limitations based on timing or resources. So it's important to ask yourself, are there any limitations? And when you start to ask questions like that, you're really getting critical, and that's important because science, and the reason I had you read the article that I did last week was because when we talk about wine or alcohol and human health, there are a range of perspectives and a range of findings. And so science has a way of sort of ebbing and flowing on a particular topic. And so it's important for us to think about, what the limitations or what the scope of a particular study or article is. And that should give us some sense of how to approach it, because this is not gospel. This does not mean that white wine 100% of the time is good for the heart or bad for the heart. It doesn't mean that, every single person with ADHD should avoid sugar. So we have to pay close attention to those contextualizing details and those nuances, and those are traditionally found when we start to talk about the limitations. So it's important to ask yourself those questions. And if you can boil it down to what were they trying to figure out, how did they try to figure it out, what did they find out, and what did it mean, you're probably going to walk away with a pretty solid understanding of what that article was about. And this is important because as many of you are going into the health field or other science fields, we need to stay abreast. Science changes rapidly, and it's important for us to be reading the most recent information about best practices, because they can, again, change very rapidly. Something that maybe wasn't in favor 5 years ago may be out of favor now, and that's why it's important to be reading the most up-to-date scientific literature possible. So that kind of gets us thinking about academic journals, scientific writing, the traditional form that we think of it in terms of a scientific report. But in this class, one of the things I'm going to challenge you to do is to write in a lot of formats to a lot of different people. And so as I move that target around, it's going to be important for you to calibrate your writing according to the purpose and audience that I suggest. And so a tool that gets us thinking about that is called MAPS. And it's something I teach in all of my classes because at the end of the day, it's hard for me to anticipate with the range of future careers and aspirations in this course. It's hard for me to anticipate all of the types of writing that you will do. Some of you will go on to be nurses, some of you will become nurse educators, some of you will become radiologists, some of you will become researchers and scientists in the field. And so I can't possibly design a class that addresses all of those types of writing and all of those potential audiences. But what I can do is give you a tool that helps you think about writing in very strategic and intentional ways. And that's called MAPS. And MAP stands for Mode, Audience, Purpose, and Situation. And the value of this is that it's something that you should be thinking about before you write anything. So anytime you're confronted with a writing task, whether it's a simple email or a lab report or something else, a brochure, a fact sheet, a blog post, maybe a recommendation report, this is something that you should really take time to think through. And it's really based around a series of questions or observations. So when we talk about mode, we're really talking about the type or the genre of writing. And just like music and movies, writing has genres. And genres really are a set of expectations and a set of standards. We know one genre of writing from another genre of writing based on its parts, its pieces, the way it sounds, the way it's formatted, and those types of things. Just in the same way that we know rock and roll from jazz based on the instrumentation or the presentation of that music. And so whenever we begin a writing task, ask yourself, what am I being asked to write? And then ask yourself, what are its parts? What are its pieces? How does it look? How does it sound? And then the most important thing you can do is find an excellent example and study what makes it excellent. So, if someone's asking you to write a fact sheet, for instance, and you've never written a fact sheet, you may want to go out and examine what are the range of possibilities in terms of what a fact sheet can look like, but also what are the things that are pretty standard across all fact sheets, and then find one that you think is particularly effective and sort of deconstruct it and say, okay, how did this present information about a disease really effectively and efficiently and appropriately for a particular audience? So we always want to sort of understand what we're being asked to write. And sometimes there's a lot of nuance to that. So, when you're writing a scientific report, it may vary across fields. So a scientific report in a medical field may look different than a scientific report in another field. And that's why studying those excellent examples and paying attention to the parts and the pieces and the expectations is really important. So once we get a sense for what we're being asked to write, in terms of the format and in terms of the genre, then it's important to ask ourselves some questions about who we're writing to. And that's where we want to ask questions about the level of the person's knowledge or the reader's knowledge. We want to ask questions about why are they reading? Why are they coming to this document or this piece of writing in the first place? What are their expectations? What are they hoping to get from this? What are their preconceived notions? So you really want to sketch out and have a really good sense of who your audience is so that you can obviously have some chance of meeting their expectations and helping them solve their problems. And these are things that we'll put a finer point on throughout the semester. So every time we're confronted with a new audience, I'll ask you to do some reflective thinking about, okay, who is this audience? What do they need to know? What's their level of knowledge? And these things will really manifest themselves in pretty concrete ways. So when we talk about level of knowledge, we're really talking about language. What type of language can we use with this audience? When we talk about purpose, that may have some bearing on the format or the organization of a document. And so I want you to really think carefully about who your audience is and what their expectations are. Then we want to ask questions about our purpose. And fundamentally, that comes down to, what is this text meant to do? Am I trying to merely inform somebody about a topic or a concept? Am I trying to persuade them to do something? Am I trying to help them make a decision? Am I trying to inspire new research? Am I trying to document a process? And the answer to that question is going to necessarily inflect the other two things that we've already talked about. So, and that's really important in terms of making decisions at all levels of writing. And then the final thing I want you to think about before you start any writing task are, what are the external constraints on the writing? So am I constrained in terms of how long this document can be? Am I constrained in terms of the format? Am I constrained in terms of the amount of time that I have? The classic example I like to use, although it's not a scientific example necessarily, is the owner's manual to your car. One of the things that we know about it is that it has to fit in the glove box, because that's where those types of documents live. And so every decision you make in terms of writing an owner's manual to a car has to be viewed through the lens of, well, I've got to make it fit into a glove box. And so while it might be helpful to have one that's much bigger with, more illustrative pictures and larger text, we have to live with the constraints that we're confronted with. Another example might be you want to create an informational flyer that's going to reside on the wall of an examination room. Well, you only have an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, and maybe you have to print it in black and white. So all of your decisions kind of have to live within those constraints. And those are things that necessarily shape our writing. And so while this may seem relatively abstract and theoretical right now, I think as time goes on, you will see that these four concepts, mode, audience, purpose, and situation, will give you a new and important way of thinking about writing, and it will acclimate you to a writing task really quickly. And it will help you start to make key decisions about language, about format, about your tone or your voice, about the order in which information is presented, for example. Because the reality of the situation is this class is really going to have a moving target. We're not going to write just one type of writing consistently throughout the semester. We are going to write a lot of different types of writing throughout the semester. The only real thread that's going to tie this all together is that, for the most part, we're going to be writing about science. So this is a really important concept also in this class, and that is definitions. So it's probably no surprise to you, having read the article about caffeic acid and heart disease, that language can be a tremendous barrier to communication about science. And definitions, our ability to define unfamiliar terms and concepts, allows us really to lower those barriers. And so there's a couple of things I want you to remember about definitions, because you're going to work on these this week. In particular, you're going to be writing a formal definition, which I'll talk about in 1 second. Remember that definitions are telescopic, and by that I mean they can range from a simple synonym, so another word that means the same thing that the reader might be more familiar with, to a full-blown paragraph. So if I'm talking about something like basal cell carcinoma, for instance, I may be able to get away, based on my audience and my purpose, I may be able to get away with just saying, in parentheses, basal cell carcinoma, parentheses, a form of skin cancer, and then go on with the rest of my sentence. But I may also need to explain more about basal cell carcinoma. Maybe I need to create distinction between it and other types of skin cancers, and that's really where we start to become audience-centered. We're going to make that decision about the level and the amount of detail that we include based on our audience and their purpose for reading and what they need to know. So I want you to remember that when we're using language that may be not audience appropriate, it can be really important for us to incorporate definitions into our writing. And remember that can be a simple recalibration with a word that the reader might know, or it could be a real explanation of what that concept is and what it means to the reader. And definitions really are essential to effective meaning making. And so it's really important for us to be on the lookout. From this point forward, I'm going to use the term jargon. And jargon is language that is unique to a particular community of people. You've probably heard it in technical and non-technical sort of contexts. You may hear it in, if you work in a hospital, you may hear people talking about if you're not a radiologist, you may hear people who work in radiology talking about things, and you may have no idea what is happening in that conversation, even though they're speaking English. And that's really what we're talking about when we talk about jargon. And so it's really important for us to be kind of jargon hawks and to be conscious of the language that we're using and making sure that it is appropriate and accessible to our readers. Finally, this all sort of comes together in this respect. I'm going to ask that the paragraph summary that you wrote for week 1 be rewritten with these things in mind. And that's going to be a pretty consistent ethic in this class, that we are going to take a process orientation to writing. And this is not just because I think it's a good idea. It's because it really is a process orientation really is the backbone to science and scientific writing. Good scientific writing really is predicated on peer review and feedback. And so revision is going to be something that you have to become accustomed to doing in this class, because good writing just doesn't happen. Good writing is developed over time through a process that involves feedback and revision. And so I'm going to ask that you take that paragraph that you wrote, the paragraph summary of a very difficult and dense scientific journal article, and I'm going to ask that now you rewrite it using the knowledge that has been passed on through this presentation and through other activities in the class. And so I'm going to ask that you maybe try to incorporate some definitions. I'm going to ask that you maybe revisit the article and zoom out a little bit and try not to get bogged down, because the ability to read and distill and then transmit information elegantly and succinctly is really important. And so the last thing we want to do is read something that has tremendous consequences and get bogged down in the things that don't matter as much, the minutia, the methodologies. Because at the end of the day, every scientific article that you read has a bottom line that's really important, that has the potential to change the way we do things in very practical terms, and we have to identify that, and we have to think carefully about what that means to us in our position as practitioners and as scientists. So that's about it, but really this was about thinking about scientific journals. It was thinking about what they do, why they exist, how we should use them, and how we should read them. It was thinking about how to take information and transmit it into new forms, and it was about thinking about language and how we can be in command of our language so that our audience always has a fighting chance of understanding what we're talking about.